All right, welcome to part two of Module 5. So we've just been talking about some of the challenges or some of the things to consider with the deception of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos and some of the implications that that has for uh, folks in business thinking about technology. And I ended with the idea that when we're thinking about innovation, that we can think beyond just disruptive innovation, and that there are other ways in which we might think about it. So for the second part of this lecture for Module 5, we're going to be talking about monopolies and specifically about how we think about monopolies in a platform digital economy, and that some of our thinking about monopolies is perhaps being challenged right now. And so there are some unanswered questions for us to think about when we think about business ethics. Um, so, as a bit of a kind of a refresher on competitive free markets, so we talked briefly about some of these ideas when we talked about the tensions and differences between neoliberalism and socialism. So we'll go through this kind of quickly. But when we're talking about competitive free markets and the kind of the ways in which we understand them to work, we understand them and we talk about them in this perfectly free or this perfectly competitive free markets. And what that means is that there are numerous buyers and sellers, none with a substantial share of the market. In that both buyers and sellers can freely and immediately enter or leave the market. So if there's an opportunity to enter the market, they can. If they need to, or if they want to leave, they can. That both buyers and sellers have full and perfect knowledge, both about each other, but also about the market in its entirety. So this idea that I know all the places that I can buy what I want. All the sellers know all the people that want to buy it, and that there's nothing about what's being bought or sold that is unknown to the other side. So this idea of perfect knowledge, and that there are no external parties such as governments that regulate the price, quantity, or quality. And so this is kind of the idea that libertarians have about the problems of government intervention, having seatbelt laws or regulations, that it interferes with this idea of competitive and free markets. And so, in a perfectly competitive free markets, the idea is that prices rise when fewer goods are available, and this induces sellers to provide greater quantities of goods. And as more goods are made available, prices tend to fall, and this will lead sellers to decrease the quantities of the goods that they provide. And so this reaches what we call market equilibrium. And in market equilibrium, there is no incentive to produce an additional unit. That producing an additional unit will require prices to fall below their optimal prices, and that buyers have no incentive to either buy or not buy an additional unit. That buying an additional unit will the cost will be smaller than what we call their utility. And so, logically, in kind of, in a very abstract sort of way, this makes a lot of sense. And the idea is that this perfect market leads buyers and sellers to exchange their goods in a way that is just. So if there is, if we're in a situation in which, I'm only buying as much as I want, I'm only selling as much as I want, and if there is a cheater, that they're going to be punished by the markets. And so if I sell an inferior good and claim it to be something else, that I'm not going to be able to sell a second unit of that, because everyone knows that I'm cheating. It also, the competitive forces pushes producers and consumers to allocate and use and distribute goods efficiently. So we talked about this when we talked about the benefits of capitalism, is that it forces the most efficient use of resources, that it drives down costs for consumers, so that I, as a producer, am incentivized to produce goods more efficiently in lower prices if I want to stay competitive. It also ensures that there's no overconsumption. If there is, prices are set, at their market value, I'm not going to buy more than I benefit from, and so I'm not going to overconsume. And so, see, these are some of the arguments that are being made about, for example, healthcare. So, if we socialize healthcare and consumers don't pay directly the price for their healthcare, that there's a risk that consumers may consume more healthcare than the cost of which benefits them. Again, I think in some situations we get into kind of some mental acrobatics to try and understand what these might mean. But I think for a lot of products and services, this makes sense. That if we underprice medication, that I'm more likely to use that medication than is perhaps actually beneficial to me. Same with electricity. So this is kind of one of the arguments against governments regulating utility rates, is that if you underprice electricity, that consumers are going to naturally consume more electricity than they would if they had to pay the direct costs of it. And consumers do have to pay the whole cost of electricity, but they just might not do it directly. And so, these sorts of market, anytime we distort the markets, either through government regulation or through imperfections in the market, that there's inefficiencies, and that the ultimate good isn't met. And then the other good thing, or the other positive attribute of competitive free markets, is that it sets these prices in just and fair ways, in a way that respects the buyers and sellers' right of free consent. That no one is forced to buy anything that they don't want to buy. No one is forced to sell anything at a price that they don't want to sell. That we have the freedom to make these choices as long as we're willing to accept the consequences of it. However, there's not always situations in which there are, free and competitive markets, and so, we've talked about a couple of different kinds of market failures. We've talked about externalities. We've talked about the challenge of privatizing certain public goods, but a monopoly is another kind of market failure in which there are two missing characteristics. That one seller or a single seller has a substantial share of the market. And this can occur through horizontal integration, so mergers and acquisitions, so that there's a collection of many different companies, many different sellers, and that they, over time, as capitalism tends to do, that they concentrate and become one seller, or act as one seller in the case of an oligopoly. And then the other is that sellers cannot freely and immediately enter the market. And this is can be due to high barriers to entry. So a natural monopoly that occurs is when a firm has a patent on a technology. So if you have a patent on the technology, you are in a situation to be the exclusive provider or exclusive producer of the product or service that's patented. There also might be situations in which there's high initial investment. So this is often the situation for having utilities monopolized, in that in order to provide electricity, you have to build a power plant, which can be quite expensive, and so in order to make sure, in order to guarantee, or for utility companies to build power plants, they often require that local governments give them monopoly rights as the utility provider. Because if there were multiple, if they had to compete in a competitive market, that they wouldn't be able to recoup their high initial investment costs. And the same situation is argued for high-speed internet connection. And so this has been a big topic of conversation in North Carolina when we're talking about high-speed internet, is that there are many parts of the state in which a cable provider has exclusive rights to provide high-speed internet to residents, and they argue that they can't provide high-speed internet to everyone in the areas that they have the monopoly, because there's some consumers where it's too costly to lay down the wire. And so there have been questions about whether or not we should continue to allow these companies to have exclusive monopolies if they're not going to provide service for all potential customers. But the reason why is that the high initial investment, and this relates to government regulations. That there's some situations in which we provide a monopoly because one, in order to ensure that a company will make the investment to provide the service, they have to be guaranteed a monopoly. But there are other situations in which it's probably good not to have multiple service providers. There's an interesting argument that the government has a monopoly over the army. You can't have private armies, private militias in the United States, and there's probably a good reason for that. There's probably good cause. You can't have a private justice system. The government has a monopoly on the judicial system in our country. There are these interesting situations in which these monopolies occur. Some are more intellectual exercises, but the reality is that very often and in many situations we do face these monopolies, and sometimes the cost the cost of the monopoly outweighs the benefits, and sometimes the benefits outweigh the costs, and so that's a bit of what folks have to consider. So some of the costs of the monopolies are unchecked prices. So without competition, there's no pressure to keep prices low. And not only can this lead into higher prices, but it can lead to discriminatory situations in which companies may charge more or less for certain customers. The idea that if you have a monopoly, that you don't have to treat everyone fairly, because if customers are unhappy with how they're being treated, they have nowhere else to go. And so that's the bit of the power that monopolies have. And then also, when they're monopolies, firms have no incentive to invest in research and development and improvement. So this has been a big argument with the cable providers, and that internet, high-speed internet providers have no incentive to invest in improvements in their internet infrastructure. Because there's no competition. So why would they make that investment? I don't have a choice, to go somewhere else. And so, the internet service provider doesn't feel the need to upgrade their service to keep me as a customer, because they know that I'm going to buy their service regardless of the quality. Lack of customer choice. So again, this relates to the internet service provider. Here in Boone, if I want high-speed internet, for the most part, unless I'm in a certain part of town, I have to use Spectrum. That there's no other options for me to use. Even if I dislike Spectrum, I think they're an evil corporation and don't want anything to do with them. If I want high-speed internet to my house, I have to go through Spectrum. But an important point, as we were just talking about, that not all monopolies are legal. So there are natural monopolies, public utilities that are regulated by the government, mass transit systems, government licenses, the right to operate without direct competition, patents, copyright and trademarks. And so the idea is that while not all monopolies are illegal in the United States, we do have regulations about preventing actions to create or maintain a monopoly. So if you engage in monopolistic activities or anti-competitive behaviors, is often how it's referred to, that is likely to cross a number of different antitrust legislation and regulations that we have in the United States. So oftentimes in business ethics classes, they go through the different kind of laws and regulations, and I'm somewhat hesitant to go down that road. In part because I'm not sure how much of that folks will really remember, but mostly because I want to talk about a different idea and something that is becoming more and more interesting to think about, and that's this idea of technology or monopolies in the modern economy. Historically, antitrust violations have resulted from human activity, usually through conspiring or collusive agreements. So it's this idea that traditionally, if there's a merger and acquisition, those are decisions that humans are making. Or if there's collusion, that happens behind closed doors as examples of anti-competitive behavior. And so that's, interestingly enough, what most of our, antitrust, anti-competitive regulations are geared towards, are these situations. But however, in the modern era, there's some very interesting things that are happening. This idea that machines and networks can be used to engage in anti-competitive behavior. And so as we continue to receive information, shop, and communicate through computing platforms, there's this interesting idea that anyone who controls the platform can use technology to protect its market position. And so we've reached an interesting point, in our economy where traditionally we've seen markets as places where transactions occurred. But what we're seeing more and more is that transactions are occurring on platforms rather than markets. And so, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by platforms. And so this narrow definition of platform is an intermediary that makes a market to bring together buyers and sellers. So platforms include things like the stock exchanges for public equities, eBay and Amazon are e-commerce platforms. Apple's App Store for developers of smartphone apps for your iPhone. Google's ad platform for websites and advertisers. And so what's different about a market and a platform is that the market is where groups of buyers and sellers tend to congregate in order to exchange. And so there's no, the ownership of the market isn't owned by any individual player or it's a public good. But platforms are different in that what we have is a situation in which you have a private actor who acts as the marketplace, and so they have an incentive to manage and structure the market in such ways that benefit themselves. And so this becomes particularly pernicious or particularly a situation in which there's potential for abuse of power when one of the platform actors is in fact a buyer or seller, him or herself, or itself in the case of a company. But we can also think about platforms more broadly, and think about it as intermediaries that bring together groups of users to facilitate economic or social exchange. And so in this way, it's payment networks, so Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and the idea is that if I use, a Visa credit card, that I am, that is facilitated through Visa. Also social platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Match.com, and then media, papers and websites, bringing together advertisers, consumer, and content. So this platform idea is really this idea, a market is a place in which you have buyers and sellers that are coming together. The platform is when there's buyers and sellers that are coming together that is facilitated by a third party. And so we have to think about some interesting ways in which these have effects on transacting on platforms rather than transacting in open markets. So one of the unique things to think about are the network effects. So if you're exchanging via a platform, there are some interesting things to think about. So the network effects are the set of complementary products as a primary determinant of the demand for an industry's product. So network effects don't just apply to platforms, but they're particularly relevant and particularly salient when we're talking about platforms. Um, and so that definition is a little confusing. So let's give some examples here. Um, if developers want to create products for Windows, iPhone, Android because of the consumer base, consumers are attracted in part because of the applications. So people that want to have Visa cards, they want them because they're widely accepted, and merchants want to accept them because most people have them. And then traders want to trade in markets where they can easily find counterpartners and where the market is liquid. I think the simplest way to think about network effects in a platform is to think about the power of Facebook. And so you can make the argument that Facebook is a good or bad social media platform. You could argue that Alex's faceplant is a better social media platform on objective measures in comparison to Facebook. But part of the interest in joining Facebook is not just because the platform or the product is better or worse than its alternatives, but because there are so many other users on the platform. And so one of the reasons to join a social media platform is to connect with other people. And if there aren't any other people on that social media platform, the attractiveness or the demand for that social media platform is going to be less, irregardless of the quality of the platform. In contrast, when you have a platform like Facebook, in which something like 1 in 5 computer users are active users of Facebook, part of what is attractive about Facebook is that I'm going to be able to connect with other people on Facebook. And so the network effect is this idea in which the attraction of the platform is because of its large user base. And it can create a situation in which, to be able to compete, you would have to have this large user base in order to even be competitive. Regardless of the quality of the product, regardless of the quality of the platform, to be competitive, even to be considered, you would have to have a similar number of users, and so it creates a positive feedback loop in that because more people are attracted to Facebook because of its large user base, that attracts more users, which makes the platform even more attractive. And so a similar situation occurs with Amazon for e-commerce. As a seller, as an e-commerce seller, if I want to get in front of potential consumers, I know that I have to go to Amazon. The reason that me as a consumer, I'm interested to go to Amazon is because I know that it's the largest marketplace, that I can go to. And so there's going to be lots of sellers that have stuff that I want. And so it creates this positive feedback loop and blocks or locks out other competitors from entering into the market, despite the fact that Amazon has not engaged in any sort of the typical or traditional behaviors that we consider anti-competitive. They haven't blocked other online retailers from opening up websites. They haven't discouraged online retailers from opening up websites. They haven't done any of the kinds of things that we traditionally associate with anti-competitive behavior. However, we can start to see that they're really acting, in sort of a monopolistic type way. So the concern about platform markets is that people will coordinate on a dominant platform. So the competition between platforms end up being a winner-take-all. So eBay has pretty much won out on online auctions. That there's no other viable option. Google, overwhelmingly has won out in the online search. So if I'm going to search for something, I'm going to use Google. And while there are some individuals, typically, more for moral reasons than for practical reasons, choose to use other search engines. That is such a small percentage of the user base, and again, the more users Google has, the more powerful they become, and the more attractive they are to both buyers and sellers. And so over time, new platforms may find it difficult, if not impossible, to enter against an existing platform with a strong user base. So the potential dynamic for inefficiencies, people would switch if other people were switching. And so we saw that, I guess about almost a year ago, when there was this big push to stop using Facebook. People were posting on Twitter, and folks were advocating against being Facebook users. But the problem is that not enough people left Facebook to join another platform. And so Facebook, despite having some very valid criticisms oriented towards them, was able to maintain their market dominance, in large part because they continue to have such a large user base. So examples might include, possible to have better operating system than Windows, but it's hard to convert people because of existing application and user base. So this idea that because Windows has so many applications that are written for it in certain industries, the idea of using a different operating system is near impossible. So there are some ethical questions. So one of the interesting things with these monopolies, with these network effects on these platforms, is that consumers benefit from platform monopolies. So these network effects mean that there are greater benefits to using these large networks. So this is one of the big arguments that people have made for why we shouldn't regulate these internet monopolies, is because consumers win out, consumers benefit. So by Google having such a large body of knowledge and a large understanding of user behavior online, they can make better experience for me as a user. Amazon, because it is such a large network, that ends up, giving me access through their platform to the lowest prices, to the best reviews. I can find what I'm looking for, and so ultimately, there's this very tricky argument that, unlike monopolies in the past, in which the monopoly actors tended to use their power against consumers, there's this very strange thing that these modern platform monopolies tend to benefit consumers. And then there are also, the arguments, some of the kind of older arguments about the benefits of monopolies, is that there is some truth that when you have these large actors, that they're able to leverage economies of scale and scope and operate more efficiently and pass those savings on to the consumers. So we have some of these newer arguments about the network effects and some of these traditional arguments about the benefits of monopolies with economies of scale and scope. But there are real costs of these online monopolies that go to competitors. So if I want to set up an online retailer and try and do so in a way that doesn't go through Amazon, I'm going to be in a difficult situation. That's going to be an uphill battle. If I want to do advertising, online advertising, and not go through Google, I'm going to have a difficult time. And so, the argument is that while Amazon and Facebook and Google, that these, essentially online monopolies benefit consumers, they have clear costs to competitors and to other related businesses. And so, it's a weird situation because most of our antitrust regulation were written to protect consumers. And so a lot of the regulators, when they're making decisions, they consider not what the effect is on other competitors, but what the effect on the end consumer is going to be. And so in judging whether or not to break up a company, one of the big things that they think about is the effect on the consumer. So when we're thinking about the responsibilities of the government to intervene, there's a tricky question here because they are required to think about the effects on the consumer. And by breaking up these online platforms, it's going to have negative effects on the consumer. It raises some interesting ethical questions, some ethical obligations, and the debate about these online platform monopolies. And I think it raises some interesting questions, as a business. How do you operate? How do you interact with these businesses? Do you make decisions to engage with these businesses, furthering their monopolistic tendencies, or do you try and fight back, knowing that that's very much going to be a losing battle? That because of the powerful effects of positive feedback loops and network effects, your ability to create a counter narrative is going to be very limited. But I do think there is some interesting debates that are happening now. I think we're starting to see some of these problems and some of these limits, and so it's becoming part of the political conversation. And so again, I think it'll be, from a business perspective, it's going to be interesting to see how the business community, folks like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and trade groups and these sorts of organizations that have tended to kind of side, have not had the same kinds of questions that we have right now, where they fall down. So that's the end of Module 5. I hope there's been some interesting things here for you. Again, if you guys need some extra time on the quiz, please let me know and we can make those changes. And hopefully we'll be getting up the next lectures up here shortly. All right, thank you all very much.